Father Adrian Clarke and Aylin Demir were strangers from two different worlds, a devoted English priest and a reserved Turkish teacher. Yet their names would become forever linked in a chilling mystery that began with obsession, crossed borders, and ended with nothing but a crucifix pulled from dark waters. Father Adrian Clarke was a man admired by nearly everyone who knew him. In the quiet English village where he served, his name was tied to kindness, devotion, and a steady presence that people relied on. He had spent years guiding his parish, offering comfort to the grieving, and preaching sermons that carried a gentle but powerful message. Many in the community considered him more than just a priest. He was a trusted confidant, a figure of moral strength. That was why his sudden resignation shocked everyone. It was not announced in advance, nor did he explain his reasons. One Sunday, he delivered what would be his final sermon, and by the following week, he was gone. The church stood silent, its doors locked, with no clear word about where he had gone or why. Rumors spread quickly. Some suggested he had suffered a crisis of faith, while others whispered about a secret illness. But beneath the surface, one rumor grew louder than the rest. Parishioners had noticed a woman, a stranger, who had once appeared at a village event months earlier. She had not stayed long, but Adrian's attention to her had not gone unnoticed. When it was discovered that the woman was Aylin Demir, a Muslim student from Turkey, the whispers sharpened. Could a man so devoted to his vows have walked away from everything for her? The truth revealed itself in fragments. A neighbor claimed to have seen him packing a suitcase late one night. Another swore he was spotted at the train station carrying only a small bag and a wooden crucifix. Then came confirmation. Adrian Clarke had boarded a flight to Istanbul. The priest who had promised lifelong devotion to God had instead chosen a path no one could have imagined. Aylin Demir was not a woman who drew much attention to herself, yet her presence lingered in the memory of those who met her. Born and raised in Turkey, she had left her home for several years to pursue her education in England. During that time, she kept a modest lifestyle, attending classes, working part-time in a small cafe, and spending her free hours reading in the corner of libraries where no one disturbed her. She did not socialize often, but those who knew her described her as polite, reserved, and focused on her studies. It was during this period abroad that Father Adrian first encountered her, though she never appeared aware of the impression she had made on him. When her studies ended, Aylin returned to Istanbul. She rented a small flat in a modest neighborhood near the old districts of the city, where narrow streets buzzed with daily life. She worked at a language institute, teaching English to students eager to improve their skills. Neighbors described her as quiet, sometimes seen walking to the nearby market with her scarf tucked loosely over her hair. She rarely stayed out late, and her apartment light could often be seen burning into the night as she worked at her desk. Although she had blended easily into the rhythms of Istanbul, a shift began the day Adrian arrived. People noticed a foreign man waiting outside her building, watching without speaking. Though he never approached her directly, his constant presence unsettled those who paid attention. Aylin herself never mentioned him, and if she noticed, she gave no sign. Yet whispers began to spread through the neighborhood. Who was this priest-like figure following her so quietly, and why had he crossed a continent just to be near her? Kerem Yilmaz had lived his entire life in the same Istanbul neighborhood where Aylin settled after returning from England. Unlike her quiet and reserved nature, Kerem was outgoing, known by almost everyone on his street. He made his living as a photographer, capturing the essence of city life. Children chasing pigeons in the squares, fishermen along the Galata Bridge, the swirl of people moving through narrow markets. His work was not widely famous, but locals admired the way his photographs told stories of ordinary moments. With his camera always slung over his shoulder, he became a familiar figure, always watching, always framing the world through a lens. It was this habit that placed him in the middle of a mystery he never expected. As Adrian Clarke lingered around Aylin's apartment, Kerem's camera captured him again and again. At first, it was purely accidental. Adrian appeared at the edge of frames, a tall, serious-looking man in foreign clothes, standing apart from the lively Turkish crowd. Later, however, Kerem began to notice a pattern. The man was never far from Aylin. Whether she walked to the market, took the tram, or entered her workplace, Adrian was nearby, often in the background, sometimes just steps away. Curiosity pulled Karam deeper. He began sorting through his negatives, circling the instances where Adrian appeared. What unsettled him most was the consistency. Adrian never smiled, never looked distracted, never broke his steady gaze in her direction. It was as if he existed only to follow her movements. Karam shared his suspicions quietly with friends, but most dismissed it as harmless coincidence. Still, he kept documenting. The photographs, initially casual street scenes, grew into something darker, an unintentional archive of a priest's obsession, frozen forever on strips of film. When Adrian Clarke arrived in Istanbul, he carried only a suitcase, a few clothes, his well-used Bible, and a small wooden crucifix. The city was overwhelming to him at first, its constant noise, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the call to prayer echoing across rooftops. He rented a small, plain flat on the outskirts of the neighborhood where Aylin lived. From there, he began building a routine that revolved entirely around her. Each morning, he would walk past her building, sometimes waiting for hours just to see her step outside. In the evenings, he returned to his empty apartment, where he wrote in his journal about her movements in painstaking detail. The journal, later recovered by investigators, revealed the depth of his obsession. Page after page recorded Aylin's actions, what time she left for work, which street she walked, even what color scarf she wore that day. His words shifted from admiration to fixation, and his entries grew darker as time went on. He wrote of her as if she were destined to be part of his life, regardless of her own choices. Though Adrian never attempted direct contact, he made his presence felt. Shopkeepers remembered him standing silently near market stalls, watching her from a distance. A tram conductor recalled seeing him follow her onto a carriage, always a few rows behind. To outsiders, he seemed like a foreigner fascinated by the city, but his interest was far too narrow. His world had shrunk to revolve around one person. Despite his solemn appearance, he attracted attention. Some neighbors thought he might be a lost tourist, others guessed he was a missionary. In truth, Adrian had abandoned his old life entirely, convinced that following Aylin across borders was not madness but purpose. His devotion had transformed into something dangerous. Adrian's disappearance was as sudden as his arrival. For nearly 3 months, his quiet presence had become a familiar, if unsettling, sight in the neighborhood. Then, one day, he was simply gone. His neighbors first noticed the silence. The light in his apartment, usually glowing late into the night, remained dark. The sound of his careful footsteps in the stairwell no longer echoed through the building. Days passed, and still no one saw him waiting outside Aylin's flat. At first, people assumed he had left Istanbul, perhaps returning to England after realizing the futility of his obsession. But whispers began when the absence stretched beyond a week. Police were eventually called to his apartment. Inside, they found a space that looked untouched, almost staged. His suitcase was neatly stored, his Bible sat open on a desk, and the journals where he recorded Aylin's movements were stacked in perfect order. Nothing seemed missing, except for one item. The wooden crucifix he always carried was nowhere to be found. That detail unsettled investigators, because Adrian was rarely seen without it. A neighbor came forward with a troubling memory. On the night before Adrian vanished, she heard raised voices coming from his flat. She could not make out the words, only the sharp rhythm of an argument. Then came a heavy thud, followed by silence. She had dismissed it at the time, but in hindsight, it seemed sinister. Despite a search of the building and nearby streets, no trace of Adrian was discovered. His passport, wallet, and clothes remained untouched, suggesting he had not planned to flee. To those who had watched his strange routine for weeks, his sudden disappearance was both alarming and oddly predictable. The man who had abandoned everything to follow Aylin had now vanished without a trace. It was 90 days after Adrian Clarke first set foot in Istanbul when a discovery shifted the story from mystery to something far darker. Early one morning, fishermen along the Bosphorus hauled up their nets, expecting the usual catch of mackerel and sardines. Instead, tangled among the ropes was a waterlogged object that felt heavier than it should have been. When they pulled it onto the deck, they found a wooden crucifix, cracked and swollen from the sea. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than discarded debris, but closer inspection revealed faint markings carved into the back, 2 initials, AC. The crucifix quickly made headlines once investigators confirmed the initials matched Adrian Clarke's name. It was the only tangible evidence of him since his disappearance. The details struck a chilling chord with those who knew him, because the crucifix had been his most prized possession, something he carried since his early days as a priest. To find it abandoned in the water suggested a violent end or a deliberate message. Speculation grew rapidly. Some believed Adrian had taken his own life, unable to reconcile his obsession with his faith. Others suspected he had been pushed into the water, the crucifix slipping free during the struggle. There were even rumors that the object had been placed there intentionally, as a warning or a symbol meant to be found. The fisherman who discovered it described the crucifix as unnerving, saying it seemed almost out of place in the nets. For the police, it became the central piece of evidence, but it raised more questions than answers. Without a body, no one could confirm Adrian's fate. The crucifix, worn by the sea, stood as a haunting reminder of a man who had disappeared into shadows. The investigation into Adrian's disappearance took a new turn when police uncovered evidence of a second residence. For weeks, they had focused only on the modest flat where he was last seen, assuming it held the answers. But a trail of receipts led them to another address, a decaying building in one of Istanbul's older districts. The caretaker admitted a foreign man had been renting a room there under a different name. When officers forced the door open, what they found inside was unlike anything in his first apartment. The walls were plastered with photographs of Aylin. Some were ordinary, showing her walking to work or shopping at the market, but others were unsettlingly intimate, taken from angles suggesting long hours of surveillance. Entire sections of the wall were covered, turning the room into a shrine of obsession. Beneath the photographs lay notebooks filled with sketches of her face and passages written in both English and broken Turkish. Phrases like "chosen for me" and "she cannot refuse destiny" appeared repeatedly, scrawled with growing intensity. At the center of the room was a single chair, positioned directly in front of a large image of Aylin smiling. Investigators speculated that Adrian spent hours sitting there, staring at her picture in complete silence. The discovery disturbed even the seasoned officers, who described the space as suffocating, almost ritualistic. This secret apartment painted a portrait of a man whose fixation had spiraled into dangerous territory. It suggested Adrian had been planning something, though what that was remained unclear. The presence of maps marked with Aylin's daily routes deepened the unease. To those piecing the case together, it was no longer a story of unrequited love. It was a story of control, possession, and a devotion twisted beyond recognition. As investigators pieced together Adrian's movements, their attention turned to the one person who had unknowingly documented much of the priest's presence: Kerem, the photographer. His photographs, initially dismissed as harmless street shots, were suddenly invaluable. Frame after frame placed Adrian in proximity to Aylin, standing behind her in tram stations, lurking near her workplace, or lingering in markets. But one particular roll of film revealed something unexpected. Among the usual city scenes was an image that unsettled detectives. It showed Adrian seated at a cafe table, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with two unfamiliar men. The photograph was grainy, but their body language suggested familiarity rather than chance. Investigators tried to identify the men, but no records matched their faces. To make matters stranger, Kerem insisted he had not noticed Adrian speaking to anyone. He claimed he only realized the significance of the picture when police asked him to review his negatives. This revelation opened new possibilities. Was Adrian involved with people beyond Aylin? Could he have been lured into something more dangerous than personal obsession? Some speculated the men were criminals who targeted him as an outsider. Others believed they could have been individuals connected to Aylin's past. Kerem's role came under scrutiny as well. Police questioned why he had so many images of Adrian, but he defended himself by pointing to his street photography habits. Still, suspicion lingered. His apartment was searched, though nothing directly incriminating was found. The cafe photograph became a central puzzle piece, raising questions no one could answer. For the first time, the narrative shifted away from Adrian and Aylin alone. The unknown men suggested outside forces, perhaps dangerous ones, had entered the story. Whether Adrian had sought them out or fallen victim to them remained a mystery. Just as investigators were struggling to understand Adrian's fate, the case took another disturbing turn. Aylin herself vanished without warning. She had been seen at work only days earlier, teaching her usual classes at the Language Institute. But when she failed to appear again, her colleagues grew concerned. Phone calls went unanswered, and eventually the police were alerted. When officers arrived at her apartment, they found the door locked from the outside, a detail that immediately suggested someone else had closed it behind her. Inside, the rooms looked strangely unsettled. A half-packed suitcase sat open on her bed, filled with clothes and travel documents. It gave the impression she had been preparing to leave quickly, though no one knew where. On her desk lay a neatly folded prayer rug, as if she had just finished her evening prayers before disappearing. But the most haunting discovery was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in English. The note contained only 5 words. Asterisk, he should not have come here. Asterisk. The message was cryptic, leaving investigators divided. Some believed Aylin wrote it as a warning, implying she had feared Adrian's arrival would bring danger. Others argued it could have been planted to mislead, a staged clue meant to confuse the search. Her disappearance shifted public attention dramatically. What at first seemed like the story of a priest who lost his way now looked like something far larger. Friends of Aylin described her as frightened in the weeks before she vanished, though she never shared details. Combined with the strange note and the locked door, it appeared her life had been in jeopardy long before Adrian disappeared. With both of them now missing, investigators were left with 2 vanishing figures and a chilling sense that the truth was slipping further away. The ending of the case brought no relief, only silence and unanswered questions. Father Adrian Clarke, once a respected priest, and Aylin Demir, the quiet teacher he had followed across continents, both disappeared into the shadows of Istanbul. What remained was a single crucifix retrieved from the Bosphorus, scarred by water and time, and a note that offered more confusion than clarity. Investigators pieced together fragments of evidence, but no definitive story could ever be told. The absence of bodies, witnesses, or confessions left the case hovering between fact and speculation. Theories grew like wildfire. Some insisted Adrian had drowned, either by his own hand or at the will of someone else. Others believed he had crossed paths with criminals or the mysterious men photographed by Karam, men whose faces never surfaced in official records. A darker idea suggested Aylin herself was the orchestrator, leaving behind her cryptic message as both explanation and warning. Yet an equally compelling theory claimed she, too, had been a victim, taken by the same forces that silenced Adrian. For Adrian's parish back in England, the scandal was devastating. They struggled to understand how their priest could abandon his vows, only for his story to end in tragedy and disgrace. Meanwhile, Aylin's family in Turkey was left with nothing but grief and fear. Without answers, they could not decide whether to mourn her as gone forever or hope she had managed to escape to safety. Over time, the case slipped from the newspapers, replaced by newer stories. But for those who remembered, the haunting symbols remained: a crucifix floating in dark waters, a locked apartment, and a single unfinished sentence on a page. The truth of what happened to Adrian and Aylin still lies buried, untold.